we don't really continually challenge the idea that the signals and the alerts and the messages effectively that we are taking away from the work that these computers are now doing on our behalf may in fact be leading us, of course, not in some necessarily nefarious or large way, but perhaps a little bit over a long period of time, and may end up putting us in a position where we quote unquote run aground.
You're listening to Traction Heroes, digging in to get results with Harry Max and Jorge Arango.
Jorge, it's great to see you again. I was looking forward to this all week.
I'm so happy to see you and glad that we can make the time to catch up.
Fabulous. Well, I'm super excited. I brought a reading today that I think I've mentioned a couple of times, but haven't actually read from. That doesn't make any sense. You know what I'm saying. Um, but we've talked about this and we've talked around this. And so I wanted to read this, and I thought it would be interesting to get your thoughts on it. As is our typical protocol, I will reveal the author and title after I'm done. I beg your forgiveness for how long this is, but I have given you some very short ones in the past, so hopefully in the mix it makes up for it. You ready?
Let's do it.
All right. So, most of us assume that automation is benign, that it raises us to higher callings, but doesn't otherwise alter the way we behave or think. That's a fallacy. It's an impression of what scholars of automation have come to call the substitution myth. A labor-saving device doesn't just provide a substitute for some isolated component of a job. It alters the character of the entire task, including the roles, attitudes, and the skills of the people who take part in it. Automation does not simply supplant human activity, but rather changes it, often in ways unintended and unanticipated by the designers. Automation remakes both work and worker. When people tackle a task with the aid of computers, they often fall victim to a pair of cognitive ailments: automation complacency and automation bias. Both reveal the traps that lie in store when we take the Whitehead route to performing important operations without thinking about them. Automation complacency takes hold when a computer lulls us into a false sense of security. We become so confident that the machine will work flawlessly, handling any challenges that may arise, that we allow our attention to drift. We disengage from our work, or at least from the parts of it that the software is handling, and as a result, may miss signals that something is amiss. Most of us have experienced complacency when at a computer. In using email or word processing software, we become less vigilant proofreaders when the spell checker is on. That's a simple example, which at worst can lead to a moment of embarrassment. But as the sometimes tragic experience of aviators show, automation complacency can have deadly consequences. In the worst cases, people become so trusting of the technology that their awareness of what's going on around them fades completely. They tune out. If a problem suddenly crops up, they may act bewildered and waste precious moments trying to reorient themselves. Automation complacency has been documented in many high-risk situations, from battlefields to industrial control rooms to bridges of ships and submarines. In one classic case involving a 1,500 passenger ocean liner named the Royal Majesty, which in the spring of 1995 was sailing from Bermuda to Boston on the last leg of a one-week cruise. The ship was outfitted with a state-of-the-art automated navigation system that used GPS signals to keep it on course. An hour into the voyage, the cable for the GPS antenna came loose and the navigation system lost its bearings. It continued to give readings, but they were no longer accurate. For more than 30 hours, the ship slowly drifted off its appointed route. The captain and crew remained oblivious to the problem, despite clear signs that the system had failed. At one point, A mate on watch was unable to spot an important location buoy that the ship was due to pass. He failed to report the fact. His trust in the navigation system was so complete that he assumed the buoy was there and he just didn't see it. Nearly 20 miles off course, the ship finally ran aground.
Wow. That's a great story. Well, it's a tragic story. I hope no one was hurt, but wow, that's such a great illustration. You know what was running through my mind as the point of your story was becoming clear that I think that we might have to consider renaming this podcast to Seeing Clearly with Harry and Jorge, because it seems like so many of our conversations are circling around this idea that we are just fallible. Like our ability to sense what's going on is beset by all these distortions. Anyway, I'd love to hear the name of this book and who the author is.
Yeah, and I'll tell you in a second, but I think the true irony of all of this was that my infallible memory had incorrectly categorized the mental fallacy here. I went looking through everything I had for a term called learned complacency, and it was nowhere in the book that I knew it was in. So it turned out it was called something else. And this book is called The Glass Cage: How Our Computers Are Changing Us by Nicholas Carr. And I studied this book when I was leading the effort at Rackspace to design the open cloud control panel because it was basically a sophisticated cockpit, much like an airplane. And that is what Nicholas Carr in this book explores a lot of. It was a fascinating read on how we can be lulled into this false sense of security or false sense of complacency, um, and end up, running aground, so to speak. And incidentally, no one was hurt, apparently. That was the next sentence, but I cut it out because the reading was so long.
This is a rare occurrence where you've brought up a book that I have in fact read. I remember reading The Glass Cage, and the story when you were going through it's like I feel like I've heard this. But I was just revisiting my notes now that you mentioned the name of the book, and I read it 9 years ago, so it's
Mhm.
excusable. Um, but let's circle back to this idea that technology can make us complacent, because that does strike me as a very serious occupational hazard for
Mhm.
for many people today, right? We end up being overly dependent on these systems that we believe are providing accurate information, whether it be readings on the environment or feedback. And oftentimes that's a bad assumption to make, right?
It's such a deep challenge because, an assumption is effectively an uncritically held belief, right? And an assumption is a shortcut to help us navigate the world, which is far too complex to challenge every possible thing. And so, where this gets tricky and sticky is it seems that we we start relying on technologies, and of course, today with the work that you and Greg are doing in AI, and a lot of the work that I'm leading that definitely touches product teams in AI, it is so easy to forget that these systems are in their infancy and they speak with such confidence when interacting with an LLM in a conversational mode. And yet there's this concept of hallucination, but I think we don't really continually challenge the idea that the signals and the alerts and the messages effectively that we are taking away from the work that these computers are now doing on our behalf may in fact be leading us off course, not in some necessarily nefarious or large way, but perhaps a little bit over a long period of time, and may end up putting us in a position where we quote unquote run aground.
Mm. That's very, very interesting. I want to unpack the AI thing because I think I have a bit of a contrarian view on that.
Hmm.
But but before I do, I want to circle back to your definition of assumption as an uncritically held belief. There are good reasons why we make assumptions. We don't want to be expending lots of energy on things
Hmm.
that function normally the vast majority of the time. I think the critical thing is for systems that are, let's call them mission critical, you need to have backups and you need to be aware of where the mission critical systems are and maybe apply that more critical lens to those parts of the system.
Hmm.
Because if we are second guessing every component of the system, we're going to expend so much time and energy that we're not going to be effective either.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to know where you should be critical and where you might expend your mental energy elsewhere. So I don't want to be critical of assuming because assuming things can be very helpful.
100%. And I think what's so interesting about this is that I think the deeper problems are a function of the second and third order effects. I think it's easy for us to perhaps aim to compensate for the first order effects. Like if I'm the one interacting with a new piece of technology and I recognize that I'm in a mission critical or no fail environment, I may be able to compensate a little bit for by adding a protocol or by ensuring that I have some kind of mitigation path or some other way of checking my math. And I think where this gets interesting is as it starts to cascade out and you start relying on other people who are relying on these technologies or other people who are relying on other people who are relying on these technologies, that's where I think the distortion or the deletion or the overgeneralization of signals or alerts or messages or uh, the the kind of what is it? What happens when you get immune to these things? When an alarm, a car alarm keeps going off and you just stop paying attention to it after a while. And as these systems get layered into social systems, this becomes very, very difficult to manage for, it seems to me. And so it's no longer about the first order effects of an assumption, but the deeper underlying system that we're relying on here.
In system design, we have this concept of alert fatigue. I think that that's what you're referring to, right?
Mhm.
The fact that if you are overwhelming the user with alerts that there's that old fable about the boy who cried wolf, right?
Of course, yeah.
Which I think is slightly different. That's about raising false positives in some way.
Mhm.
But I want to circle back to the AI thing because I totally hear what you're saying. We are now in the midst of digital systems that have been packaged for us as artificial intelligences. And I'm saying
Mhm.
that in a very intentional, I'm being very intentional with how I talk about it. They're being
Mhm.
packaged as intelligences. There is serious conversation about whether we are reaching artificial general intelligence or even like super intelligence,
Mhm.
which gives the impression that these systems are somehow smarter than humans, right?
Mhm.
And that feeds into the danger that you're calling out, which is these systems are very far from perfect. They are prone to making stuff up. And if we design systems around components that we assume are somehow infallible or smarter than us, but are in fact fallible, we might end up running aground. But where I have a slightly contrarian view is I think that if you actually start becoming educated on how I don't like using the phrase artificial intelligence because it's such a broad subject, but it
Mhm.
is the term that is being used in mainstream media and such. So I'll talk about artificial intelligence, meaning the kinds of systems that people now understand to be artificial intelligences, things like
Hmm.
ChatGPT and Claude and things like that. If you understand how they work under the hood, you'll very quickly come to an appreciation of their capabilities and constraints.
Hmm.
And in my case, I'm not going to generalize, but in my case, understanding how those things work under the hood has made me a lot more skeptical of their output than I would have been had I been buying the media narrative.
Hmm.
I've come to understand computing systems as being of two kinds. There is deterministic computing, which is the old school, you write a program, 10 print hello Harry, 20 go to 10 kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Where it has like a predictable flow. Given the same inputs, it's always going to produce predictable outputs, uh, assuming there are no physical issues with the underlying computing substrate, right? So that's the old school deterministic computing. And now we have AIs, which are probabilistic computing systems. That's a very different animal.
Hmm.
By definition, the outputs are not going to be as predictable as, and in fact, that's what makes them useful. So I think that if you come to an understanding of how they work, you might find yourself being more skeptical of their ability or their infallibility, you know. So I'm kind of two minds about it. I think that the danger of relying too much on AI is just because we're in a stage of the development of the technology where people are very excited to roll out AI into everything, and we haven't yet quite found what the sweet spot is. I think that the sweet spot is somewhere combining the best of deterministic and probabilistic computing, but I think I'm taking us off the subject now. I want to circle back to this idea of questioning our assumptions. What made you bring this reading to our conversation?
Any number of things, but one of them was a story where I was traveling to Blacksburg, Virginia for Rackspace, and I got up one morning at 5 o'clock and had to get to the airport, and punched into my GPS, how do I get to the airport, and hopped in the car and started driving, and I didn't know where I was going, right? I just followed the instructions, and eventually the road went from 4 lanes to 2 lanes, and then from 2 lane to 1 lane, and then from 1 lane to a gravel road. And then I got to a sign that said, "You have reached the end of Airpoint Boulevard." I had hit the wrong thing. I had either typed the wrong thing or hit the wrong thing and had no discernment or understanding or experience of where I was going, and just blindly followed the GPS to the end of a mountain road in the middle of Virginia. And I won't I won't go into the rest of the story about how I managed to actually get on the plane with a security guard chasing me after throwing the keys to the empty table at the Hertz counter, and running through security with a guy holding on his gun chasing me, yelling, "Stop, stop!" But I just I just I just made a 2,000-mile trip to get some work done on something, and I went to AAA, and I got all my maps for free, and then I went to the bookstore and I got a brand new national map, printed out guide in case. And then I ignored all of that and I just looked at the GPS the whole time, blindly assuming it was taking me in the right direction to the right place at the right time, and that everything was going to be fine, and never thought about it. And and I had been thinking about this Glass Cage article for a while because we had touched on it. We had touched on the book a while ago. And then I read this piece and I was like, oh my God, God knows where I could have ended up over the last week while I was traveling. And I wouldn't have realized it until I got to the wrong point, because that GPS technology is, in my mind, robust now. But you know, maybe the cable comes loose. And then I inadvertently don't see the things that I'm expecting to see, but for confirmation bias or some other intellectual fallible neural matter, I ignore the signs around me and end up in completely the wrong place. And then I read this and I was like, you know, we've got to talk about this, because I know you have, I mean, you have so much experience in information architecture and wayfinding, and now you're in the middle of the AI conversation, and uh, and yet I think all of us are struggling with the dynamic complexity of all the systems that we're relying on. And we're being bombarded with things all the time. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to discern what is there that shouldn't be there and what isn't there that should be there. Uh, and then I read an article about how the folks that have hair, the younger folks are, going and getting iPods and getting them, refurbished with new software and like getting rid of their smartphones and going back to simpler technology. And I think in terms of thinking clearly and acting with confidence that's based on a real sense of what's going on. We need a better way to think about this, and I don't have it.
This feels like a conversation that merits more time than we have available now, but
Mhm.
I'll say that there might be an analogy between your being misled on this road trip with the kind of use that a lot of people are putting AI to, which is things like help steer me in some big decision that I need to make. Maybe it's
Uh-huh.
like a career decision or an investment decision or what have you. And all of the things that we talked about previously apply there, right? Like just being aware that these are probabilistic systems and they're not infallible, right? And yet, to your point earlier, they create the illusion of expertise, right? Like they come across with a great deal of self-confidence and will do things like cite sources to like gain your trust. It might be worth distinguishing between two scenarios. One scenario is the Harry driving into the back roads unwittingly, which is the scenario of someone who is using the system to help guide them through an unfamiliar task or environment, right?
Mhm.
I would imagine that you gradually got off course because you were unfamiliar with that context. Whereas if you kind of knew your way around, your gut would be telling you, no, 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 this can't be right. There's something wrong here.
Mhm.
And you would be more willing to question your assumptions because you have the environmental awareness that comes with some degree of expertise in the context.
Mhm.
So that's one use case. There's another scenario, which is you are an expert and you have decided to delegate part of your tasks, routines, expertise to these artificial systems, right?
Work.
Work. Well, I'm thinking specifically about the captain of the cruise ship
Yeah.
in that story, right? Like those people were familiar with the ship and the steering, and they're familiar with navigation in probably even in those waters, right? Like I would imagine that it might not have even been the first time they navigated that route,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um, Now, it's a particular context in that the ocean, and I know nothing about
Mhm.
ocean navigation, but I imagine that you don't have as many landmarks, right? Literally,
Mhm.
to guide you along. But my point is, it's different if you are a non-expert coming in to have the system fill in for your lack of expertise than it is if you are an expert that is delegating part of their job to the system. I think that those are two different use cases that require different critical lenses. And it might
Mhm.
be worth, and this might be a future conversation, it might be worth unpacking how you or techniques that you would use in both cases because I've
Mhm.
used AI for both of those things, right? I've used AI for things that I'm very familiar with. I just
Yeah.
want the thing to do it for me. And I've used it for things where I lack the expertise to even know if the answers it's giving me are within the ballpark, you know?
Mhm.
And those require a lot more trust than if I know the domain that we're working with.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah, it feels, interestingly, it feels like a richer topic than I originally imagined. it was going to as a function of the reading. And I feel like it's worth going back. I know we've touched on some of these ideas very early on in our conversation, and I'm tempted to go back and take a look at them, or maybe we can pick up this conversation offline a little bit and figure out how we can bring it into the foreground for folks in a way that's um, really meaningful. But I like the distinction you're making.
It's a super relevant topic. Many of us, like I'm facing this, right? Like I work with both ChatGPT and Claude every day, and it's something that in the back of my mind, I'm always second guessing it and going, yeah, is that really true? And like I said, there are some things for which I'm much better qualified to judge whether what it's telling me is trustworthy than others, right? So
Yeah.
it's an important literacy that we have to pick up, and we have to pick it up pretty quickly.
I love framing it as a literacy. That is a great way to think about this. Okay, I like it. Let's bookmark that.
This is not the first time we've put a pin on it, so maybe we have to have an AI collect all the pins for us.
That'd be a good name for a podcast. Put a pin in it.
Put a pin in it. All right, sir. Great talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Traction Heroes with Harry Max and Jorge Arango. Check out the show notes at tractionheroes.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating in Apple's Podcasts app. Thanks.